So this week's Parsha is Parshat Bo, the week where we are freed and we prepare for our freedom. And the narrative around the Pascal lamb, the lamb that we're commanded, that Bnei Israel are commanded to bring into their homes and then sacrifice, caught my eye because it reminded me of a year that Will and I lived in Israel, and we went to see the Samaritan sacrifice on Har Gerizim, which is really something. If anyone is in Israel during Pesach Sheni, I highly recommend it. And I'm not like, there's probably someone more knowledgeable than me here in this room about the Samaritans.
I'm not, I think, in this room, but Michael Weiss has given a couple of very interesting talks about it. So if you're interested in him,
yeah, they're like, they originally were Jewish people. They sort of like devolved into their own sect. There are not very many of them left in the world, like maybe 1,000. And they mostly live in Cholon near Tel Aviv and on Har Gerizim. And they have, it's really a fascinating place. Like we walked around, they have a lot of, they just stick, they have none of the rabbinic tradition. So it's a very biblically observed religion in a lot of ways. Their mezuzot look a little bit different because of that. Like everything is just a little different. But one of the things I found most fascinating is that when you get there, the kids are all sort of shepherding their sheep to the main event, and they're all adorned in like flowered necklaces and wreaths around their foreheads, and they have like different colors, I guess, to identify them. And the kids, like, they love these sheep because they've had them for a while in their homes, like as they grew. And so I just thought there was something really interesting about that, right? The kids knew what was going to happen to their beloved sheep when they got down to the show place. But they still loved them, and they had this like connection to them, which I thought was beautiful. So I'm going to share my screen to the source sheet here. So there are a few psukim that discuss the how to handle taking this lamb, this set, right? So it says, Dabru al kol adat Yisrael lemor, ba'asor lechodesh hazeh, v'ikhu lahem ish se lebeit avot, se lebayit, right? So every family or every household takes the lamb in their house. And then 3 psukim later, like there are some details about the lamb that are not important for our conversation. Right? So you have to keep watch over it. So we're being told this on the 10th of the month. We have to keep watch of it until the 14th day of the month. And that's when you slaughter the lamb. So a particular parshan that I'm very attached to, his name is Rabbi David Kasher. He's like a modern person, and he wrote this beautiful parsha blog for a long time called the Parsha Nut, or pronounced Parshanut, sort of a play on words. And he asks this question. He says, why are we waiting for 4 days? What's the value added to wait from the 10th to the 14th to sacrifice the lamb? Why not just take it on the 14th from your backyard and sacrifice it then? Why do you have to bring it into your space? So Rashi starts by trying to explain why bring this sacrifice at all, right? So he asks the same question, right? Rabbi Kasher is echoing Rashi's question. Why take the lamb in 4 days prior to its slaughtering? And why is that not commanded for all of the dorot, right? Masha lo tzivachem bepesach dorot. So many of the things that happen in this time period are meant to be laws that happen for all the future generations, right? That we still say zeh pesach v'zeh matzah v'zeh maror, right? And we hold up all the things and we eat the sandwich. Like so many things are reminiscent of that time, but we don't have anything that echoes this 4-day waiting period. So what's the value of the waiting period, and why is it just now? So Rashi's answer is interesting, but it's not really about the 4 days, right? He says that Bnei Israel needed to like bank some mitzvot in order to be redeemed. That, right, Hashem had promised, right? God promises to Abraham a few weeks back in the Brit Ben Havitarim in Parshiot that God will redeem Abraham's children. But for the last 400 years, they had not really been engaged in mitzvot. right? Lo hayu beyadam mitzvot lihitasek them. They didn't have any mitzvot to do. It's like not that they weren't doing them, they didn't have them. And so God gave them two mitzvot, the dam pesach and dam milah, shemalu ba'oto halayla. So Rashi introduces this crazy idea that the same night that they give the Pesach sacrifice, they circumcise themselves. And through the Dam Pesach and the Dam Milah, then they're sort of worthy of being redeemed. Which I think is an interesting question, whether you have to be worthy to be redeemed from slavery and from suffering. And the question is really good, right? This question about why the 4 days, why is this specific to this generation? I'm not sure that the answer is really about the 4 days. So Rabbi Kasher suggests sort of taking a step backwards and to look at why the lamb at all. Like why sacrifice a lamb instead of a chicken or offering like a meal offering, right? There are lots of other kinds of korbanot that we do, throughout our time in the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash. Why the set? So Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplexed talks about, I can make this a little bigger, talks about how the Egyptians worshipped Aries, which is the zodiac sign of the lamb, right? The Ibn Ezra also talks a lot about this, that they were sort of proto Hindu culture in Egypt, that they worshipped these animals, like the lamb, the goat, the cow. And that is why they forbade their slaughter and despised shepherds, right? And we Jews come from a line of shepherds. So for this reason, we were commanded to slaughter a lamb on Pesach and streak its blood on the doors in Egypt to cleanse ourselves of these ideas and publicly demonstrate our rejection of them. Right. So the Rambam is saying it's a way of publicly saying we are not like the Egyptians, right? We are our own people. We believe in God. We don't believe in the seh as its own God, the lamb as its own God. And the Chizkuni sort of takes it, I would say, like a step further. He says it's not just to prove publicly that we don't believe in the seh. It's to annoy the Egyptians. Right? They have to sit and watch for 4 days as we prepare their lambs, their gods, for slaughter. And they have no power to correct that problem. So I don't know how this sits with you guys, if you have any thoughts. To me, this feels like a rude chizkuni, right? Like, I guess I understand coming from the slavery position, getting to like stick it to the Egyptians before you leave Egypt. But there seems something that's like very childish about that perspective. To taunt the Egyptians while they sit by powerlessly. And I don't know that like I want to believe in a God that would want that, right? Like God commands the Jews to take the sheep in 4 days early. And so is God trying to provoke the Egyptians to realize their powerlessness? Like a few chapters later, God, according to the Midrash, reprimands the angels who are happy when the Egyptians die in the Red Sea. So like, to me, that doesn't feel like sort of the perspective that God has taken through this process. I don't know.
So, yeah, I was actually several things you said earlier were making me wonder if part of it is that you needed some amount of time to get attached to something in order for it to be a sacrifice. For instance, somebody just gives you something and says, here, go sacrifice it right away. Or even, I remember as a mother of 3 sons, oh my gosh, getting them circumcised 8 days later instead of, well, we already did that before, on the first day before anything else happened. Or even Pidyon Haben. I mean, there's, it seems for the redeeming also, it is that, it has to be yours in a certain sense if you're going to sacrifice it. I don't know.
Oh, I really like that. That's beautiful. Right. It's not as meaningful if you're just handed the thing to sacrifice. The attachment doesn't have to be like a positive attachment, right? Like your examples are all positive attachments, like to your children that they grow, but just any attachment really would make it more of a sacrifice.
Well, as you said, look, the kids that you saw, they knew what the expectation was. It was agrarian, but still in 4 days, they had some attachment to the.
I like that. You're circling the punchline, which is beautiful. No, it's great. I love that. I think that's the way that you put it also just makes a lot of sense that for it to be a true sacrifice, you need to have some kind of bonds. I think that's great. And right, it takes the Egyptians out of the equation. That's kind of what I like about it. It's not about angering the Egyptians. It's about making a meaningful sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I really didn't like that Fliskuni. So I went searching and I found like a slightly nicer take. The Kedushat Levi, which is a Hasidic source. He talks about how it was to demonstrate their faith in God here on the second line, that although slaughtering a lamb, which was a deity for the Egyptians and therefore a provocation of their masters, they were not deterred by the physical danger they were exposing themselves to by doing this. Right. So here it's not that they're like trying to anger the Egyptians, but they know that the Egyptians will be angered. And so this is some kind of like pledge of loyalty to God, that they had doubted God in the past, especially in last week's Parsha, right? Like, when is God going to take us out? Maybe God forgot about us. And here they're showing, no, I am so trustworthy that I'll do this really dangerous thing. And I know God will save me. I do think it's nicer than the Chizkuni, but I think it reminds me of that joke about the guy who's on top of a house where the water levels are rising, right? And first, like, a guy in a canoe comes by and he says, oh, I'm waiting for God. And then the helicopter comes and he says, no, I'm waiting for God. And then he dies, he drowns. And God says, like, what happened? And he says, what happened to you, God? I was waiting for you. And right. And God says, well, I sent you a canoe and I sent you a helicopter. Like, it feels kind of foolish to do something dangerous and hope that some divine power will stop the Egyptians. But at the same time, there's something about that relationship building component, which I think is lovely. But in either event, I think that there's something missing. And so Shmot Rabbah puts a sort of negative spin on what you were suggesting, Kathy, but I think that also a very human spin, right? Maimonides is coming from the assumption that the Jews don't believe in the sheep, right? But that they're sort of publicly displaying that they don't believe in the sheep. And here Shmot Rabbah, which is far older than the Rambam, says, right? The Israelites became idol worshippers and they weren't like really ready to let go of that. And I think, right, like ultimately there feels to me something very human about that. When you're stuck in another culture for hundreds of years, and you may have lost some of the strength or resonance of your own belief system. Like, of course, they became idol worshippers. That doesn't mean they didn't believe in God, but they sort of adapted the local customs as well. And so what does God say? He says, as long as Bnei Israel worship these other gods, right? Lo yigat elu. I'm not redeeming them, right? Like, I'm not redeeming someone who believes in the sheep god in the Aries zodiac sign. And he says, so Moshe, you've got to tell them to get rid of this idolatry. And what Rabbi Kasher says that I think is really beautiful here is he says, what does it mean that they had to spend those 4 days? He says it means that they had to take in their idol, their sort of like false hopes for themselves, and they had to look at it and they had to sit with it for 4 days, and they had to say, okay, I loved you. You served me this purpose while I was here as a slave in Egypt, but I'm ready to say goodbye. I'm ready to say, like, this is not serving me. This is not helping me get to the place where I need to be, and to then sacrifice it. Right. So not just to take in this particular sheep and feel attached to it, but to use that as like, I'm taking the idolatry as close as I can, and then I'm saying goodbye to it. And that 4 days was like the emotional work of saying goodbye, which I thought was particularly beautiful. I put this picture, my own blurry picture, of all these kids sort of like standing there and hanging out with their sheep, because I thought it was so fascinating. But I'm just going to stop the share because I want to share the last thing that Rabbi Kasher suggests here, because again, it just felt so resonant for me. I lost my page here. He asks this question of ourselves, right? So like the reason now, of course, that we don't have the the 4-day period is because we are no longer idol worshippers primarily, right? Or presumably, I should say. And so there was no need any longer for us to have that 4-day confrontation with the Paschal offering. And that's why it was specific to this generation. But what Rabbi Kasher says is if we want to feel related to it, right? If we want to feel that what it means to slaughter the thing that we worship, to be closer to God, to be closer to freedom, is that we have to look upon the thing we thought we needed and prepare to let it go. What are you holding on to? What falsehoods are you afraid to let go of? Take some time, sit with these parts of yourselves. Say goodbye to the thing you loved, the things that you thought would save you, and then take up the knife and cut yourself free. I think that is like a powerful piece of experiencing the redemption, right? As we'll say at Pesach, everyone should feel as though they were freed from Egypt. And so if we were sitting in that experience, what would it be like on those 4 days? What would be in our living room being prepared to be put on the altar? And how would we be able to look at it and then say goodbye and leave it behind and then feel truly free? I don't know what my things are. I've been thinking about it a lot over the last day or two, but I think it's a beautiful way of thinking about that Pesach offering. As Kathy said, it's no longer just an animal that you bought and put on the altar. It's something that you truly feel a bond and a connection to. I think that that's a powerful idea.
Yeah. Well, I have a question that I think maybe it comes in the intersection of a lot of these disciplines, which is anthropology and Jewish history and political things that were going on. But during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, what were these 4 days observed? Number one. And number two, during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, because I've always tried to visualize this, were people all over the country who could not get to Jerusalem for the regalim, were they also in each of their homes slaughtering lambs? Do we know?
So the first question is no. The 4-day wait was really only for the generation that was freed from Egypt.
But is that a rabbinic interpretation?
Yes, and I think no. Let me pull up that. The Chizkuni talks about that, but I cut it off early.
So like in the Mishnah, in Mishnah Pesachim or something like that, not Gemara, but Mishnah, what are they assuming people are doing? I forgot it.
Right, the Mishnah is certainly assuming that this was only a one-time practice.
So that's really.
Yes. It says the Chodesh Hazeh in the pasuk, right? In that it's on the source sheet, right, that you have to look after it ad arba asar yom lachodesh hazeh, the 14th of this month. And certainly it is a rabbinic interpretation that of this month doesn't really mean Nisan. It means this explicit month of this year in which you are in Egypt, as opposed to all future years where you will do the sacrifice. So that's the understanding, is that the 4-day wait period only happens that first year. But certainly, I think it would be an interesting thing to do for the 4 days before Pesach, is to think about, what you would sacrifice and what it would mean to you and what you would have to sacrifice. In terms of your second question, I'm not sure. I know that there was a practice that you would basically trade your sheep in, far away, wherever, for money. And then you would go to Jerusalem with your little bag, as opposed to your consuming animal that ate all the things that you need to bring for it. And then you would buy a new one in Jerusalem and offer that. But I don't know about the people who couldn't do the Aliyat L'Regel. It's a good question. I don't think you were supposed to do it at home, but I'm not positive. I'd have to look into that.
Do we even know what percentage of the population was doing any of this? I mean,
yeah.
I don't. I'm sure someone does. I could look into it. I mean, yes, I think they talk, right? The Navi talks about the Aliyat Regel as though everyone does it, but certainly that can't be true.
Yeah, but it's a very biased report. I mean,
Yes.
I think that's the kind of the point, which is it's so murky back there, and we hang a lot of assumptions on things that I don't know because
I mean, everybody could have been riding their bicycles around on Yom Kippur the way they do now.
Well, and certainly by the end of the Navi period, we know that things were going horribly awry and people weren't coming at all.
Yeah.
So that's certainly true. Whether they held on to the tradition of eating, right now, Ashkenazim certainly say you shouldn't eat anything roast on Pesach night because that's like sort of special for the Korban, which we can't do anymore. But I don't think that was a principle back then. Maybe everyone had their roast lamb at home.
Yeah.
Which makes it even more interesting because then you have sacrificed nothing, right?
Yeah.
well, certainly, yeah. I mean, and it is. I've always just trying to, in my mind, imagine what Jerusalem would have been like on that day and night. And
well, so I'll tell you, Har Gerizim was a sensory experience I could not have anticipated. I felt very overwhelmed by it, but the smell
yeah, and the sounds, I'm sure.
of the whole thing, and there's almost like a heat because it only comes off the animal. Like I obviously couldn't really feel it, but there's like a steaminess to the whole place as they slaughter 50 goats or sheep at one time. It was really overwhelming. Like I would not Google the pictures. I was trying to find a better picture than my own, but there were too many pictures of like goat innards, and I just had to step back. But I couldn't imagine being at the Beit HaMikdash then because like the old city is so small, and there were way more than 1,000 Jews, right, who did the Aliyah, presumably, right? There are only about 800 Samaritans when we were there. I think it was probably a bigger space, but it really, I mean, the smell must have, they talk about how like in the time, like in the 1800s, that the streets in Jerusalem, like the butcher shops would just sort of like blood would sort of be in the street and entrails, and it was like disgusting. I imagine that's what it was like in the Beit HaMikdash, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, they built whole tunnels and everything to get rid of all of that stuff.
yeah.
Right, and then where were all the people camped out that were able to?
Yeah,
I mean,
can you imagine the price of a motel room at that time?
In like Talpiot, right? Like that's sort of my assumption is that's like where we're talking about, right? You were like a hour walk away from the old city. I don't know. Yeah.
But you got to take your meat back.
Right. And that's the thing is you eat it that very night.
Yeah.
There's something like a little bit literary about that, right? Eating your words, eat it. Like if you're truly thinking about your sacrifice and then you have to actually eat it, it's more than just letting it go.
It's really interesting.
Certainly a thing I don't often think about. So it was fun to unpack and very good to unpack with you guys. I'm going to turn off the recording and then we can say goodbye. Let's see.